everybody. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Christine Minotto. I'm the director of the UCSF Roseman Institute. It's my pleasure to have Cynthia and Amrinder from Vensana Capital. One of the things then when we talk to Cynthia and Amrinder, we talk about like what would be a really interesting topic for a lot of entrepreneurs. The one that came back to us that we thought was really interesting is about leadership, strong leadership, how important it is to make and break a company. And when we talk about strong leadership, it's not just about the CEO, but it's also the board of directors. And I mentioned earlier to Cynthia and Amrinder, I have a personal experience how having a really amazing chairman of the board can help us make or break what we do. And if you have a really supportive one and really good one, it's amazing how wonder it will be. So Cynthia and Amrinder will talk a little bit about that and how to work with the board and what kind of board that will help you to achieve the goal and have all the incentive alignment, all the good stuff that you need to do. So, but before Amrinder and Cynthia is going to give a talk, I should introduce you to first is Cynthia Yee. She is a principal at Vensana Capital. She has, even though she looks young, she has a lot of investing, operating, and experience. Before she was at Vensana, she was another venture fund, and then she also work in many medical devices companies, and she was also worked at NE before. So she has a lot of different venture background. So she is part of our UC family. She went to school at UC Berkeley doing her, and actually for her undergraduate, so she's part of the UC Berkeley community. So that's Cynthia. And the next person is Amrinder Singh. He's also a principal at Vensana Capital, and Amrinder came slightly different experience. He came to Vensana from his experience at Medtronic Ventures, but before that he was involved in the operating in a business development for Medtronic. And before that he was also doing a lot of the product management and engineering position for another device company called Thoratec, who are in the Bay Area. And Amrinder is also another University of California alum. So it's always great to see more University of California and our speakers. But he got his MBA from Northwestern University. So not a bad school, but anyhow. I'll have Amrinder and Cynthia start. And I also want to remind everybody that you can ask your question and question at the Q&A box. Amrinder and Cynthia will take your question along the way. And so feel free to ask your question, and then we'll check do Q&A to make sure your question is answered. With that, take it away.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Christine. We're really excited to be here today and participating and contributing to sort of the UCSF Roseman Institute and this ecosystem. Maybe before we get started, I can tell you a little bit about Vensana Capital, which is the venture firm that both Amrinder and I work for. We are a fairly new venture fund focused on medical technology, but that's defined pretty broadly as medical device therapeutics, life science tools, diagnostics, and digital health technologies. We're comprised of a team of 8 people. All with deep domain expertise in medical devices, but we do have a sort of breadth of experience across a lot of different sectors in medical technology. We're currently investing out of our second fund, which is a $325 million fund. We have about 550 million AUM. And in our first fund, we invested in 12 companies kind of across sort of a variety of sectors that I just described. And we will look at all stages of companies, from company creation and preclinical all the way through commercial stage companies. So we're pretty open-minded in the types of opportunities we look at. My background for myself, as Christine mentioned, is pretty broad. So I've spent the last decade working with startups and in venture across a couple different firms, both very small firms all the way to multi-billion-dollar firms like NEA. And I'll tell you, I learned a lot from working in different size firms because you have different motivations and different sort of incentives. And then I started off my career in public equities, so worked with a lot of later stage public companies. Amrinder, do you want to give your background?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks to Christine and UCSF broadly for having us. Excited to talk about this topic. I think it is important. And just quickly on my background, Christine already covered it largely. I was at Medtronic for about a decade prior to this, and so a lot of kind of typical medical device experience. Also spent a lot of time there looking at digital health companies. Companies with kind of software-based businesses, approaching the market with different business models, risk-based business models, et cetera. And so I'd say about half my time I spent doing that at Medtronic, and the other half was an independent corporate ventures team, similar to the type of work we do here at Vensana. And as Christine mentioned, I started my career at a company called Thortec, which was a late-stage heart failure company. I was an engineer there for a few years and then moved over to product management. So anyway, nice to be here, and thanks again to everyone for hosting us. Between the two of us, we have served on a number of boards, whether as a board director or board observer, and we'll kind of get through the differences between that. And I think one of the key takeaways from our perspective in our experiences has been, whether as board members, working at kind of operating companies or investors, is the board is, at the end of the day, from an entrepreneur's perspective, really hopefully one that they can lean on to help with providing leadership and governance for that management team, and a really important kind of integral part of the success of the company, from our perspective. And so, on this page, kind of what is the role or purpose of the board? We highlight a few things. They typically are elected by the shareholders of the company, and we'll get into a little bit more detail around that, around the size and composition of the board. And at the end of the day, the job of the board is really to be helpful to management and kind of overseeing the duties of management and the board themselves. But I think one of the questions that comes up sometimes, especially if you haven't served on a board or if you haven't been part of a management team, is really, what is the difference between, a board person, a shareholder, or management? If the board is helping think through kind of big strategic decisions for the company, isn't that the CEO's job or the management's job, right? And I think part of that is true. So, really, when we think about the board, we think about generally, a handful of individuals that are really helping management. They're holding management responsible. They're, helping to raise financing, get primarily on kind of the big strategic questions that the company is thinking through. And that really shifts depending on the stage of the company too, right? The needs for an early stage company obviously are very different than a middle stage or a late stage company or a commercial company or one that's looking to IPO or is in the public markets. And so, I think the role of the board does evolve, but really it's there to be helping management, but really is in the service of all shareholders. Shareholders, as kind of the name implies, are really those individuals that have some level of ownership on the company. That could be, options, it could be kind of equity, stocks, et cetera, really depending on the stage of the company. It could even be debt, right? So these are the types of, these are individuals that have some level of ownership of the company. It could be very small or it could be very large. And then lastly, management, at the end of the day, their job is kind of the more day-to-day, heads down, operational focus. And, I think it's important to mention or kind of distinguish that that's not the job of the board, right? I think one of the lessons that between myself and Cynthia and others who've had board responsibility, especially for individuals who've had operational backgrounds, I think it's very common to try to roll up your sleeves and, do some of the operational work, whether it's helping them think through, markets or finance strategies or kind of commercial activities, things of that nature. But, that's really the job of the management team. And I think it's important for the board to hold management responsible, help kind of guide them, ask them the right questions. But, at the end of the day, the operations are really, the responsibility of the management team. So hopefully that helps kind of distinguish a little bit between the different terms that we use here, as well as we talk about kind of board members, shareholders, and management. we'll go to the next slide and start talking a little bit about board structure and composition. I'll pause here to see if Cynthia's audio is working any better. Otherwise, we can keep going this way too.
I think hopefully you guys can hear me now.
It's good.
Yay.
No, that's great. Thanks, Amrinder, for taking over.
I was worried because I prepped for like half of these, and so that's good. Take it away, please.
Yeah, well, I think what Amrinder was saying, there's a lot of different ways a board can be shaped. There's a lot of discretion, and that's ultimately determined by your investors and your founders and management team. But I think at a very basic level, a board is going to be representative of your underlying shareholders. And this is sort of one thing we'll always say, is that you've got to choose your partners wisely, because those are going to be the people you're working for several years. And those are the people that are going to be on your board. So it's not just about getting the financing done. It's about thinking who at that investor group is going to be a good partner for you, serve on your board, be engaged, and be supportive. Because there's a lot of different personalities involved, and you want to make sure that you have, the same vision for your company, and that your goals are aligned, so that you're working together best rather than sort of fighting each other. And so board dynamics is incredibly important, and that's often, why, when you're starting off building a company, whether it's, a new startup or, raising a follow-on round of financing, you want to make sure that everyone kind of works together really well, because that'll contribute to the board dynamics, and that'll set the tone for how everyone works together. There is no hard, fast rule on how large a board should be. I think it's important, whoever's on the board kind of has relevant experience to contribute to, what your company is, where your company is at, at its stage. But I think we like to have boards that are 5 to 7 members, because I think too small and you don't have sort of the breadth of experience or diversity of opinion that could benefit you, and too large, you're kind of spending too much coordinating schedules and you have too many opinions at the table. But, I'd say a good model board is a 5-person board, and you might have the management team represented by the CEO or founders who still have a meaningful ownership stake, as well as your early preferred investors, and maybe an independent director that might have relevant clinical or commercial experience in your sector. And I think as your company grows and matures, you'll probably raise additional rounds of financing, and they'll have representatives on the board. And so the board evolves over time. But that could include anywhere from, investors who are independent institutional investors like Vensana Capital, to corporate strategics, to sort of observers that could be representative of other institutional funds or a strategic. And it really just sort of depends on how you want to construct your board. And that's often negotiated at the time of a financing. I don't know, Amrinder, it'd be great to hear how you think about, board membership from Medtronic. Like, how did Medtronic decide whether or not you would serve on a board, and how you engaged coming from a strategic?
Yeah, it's a good question, and and just kind of open note, I think I saw a couple questions roll in. One, I think, is if just to answer those other ones really quick, or Christine, you could too, but if the recording is going to be available after, I actually don't know, but I think Christine could answer that one, Christine or Carly, or we could try to cover that at the end. And then one other question that came up is, how long is the average board tenure? We'll cover that here in a little bit as well, especially as we talk about the evolution of the board. But you can imagine an individual being part of the board for the entirety of the company's existence. I mean, obviously, as they age out, they may step down, but you also may bring on board members for very specific periods of a company. If, for example, a company is really focused on enrolling a clinical study, for the early years of their existence, they may really highlight, 1 or 2 or maybe even more members of their board who have a lot of experience, on thinking about clinical trials and execution. But as the company then gets ready to commercialize, let's say a few years later, those members may be replaced with other members who have more experience from that perspective. So hopefully that covers that. But to Cynthia's question around, strategic for corporates, I think it's a fair question, right? Especially as we think about, does it make sense to have corporates or strategics on a board? I'd be curious on Cynthia's perspective. I'll give kind of our perspective while we were at Medtronic, but Cynthia's been an institutional investor her whole career. And I think may be able to provide, a slightly different lens on that. From our perspective while we were at Medtronic, we would take board seats. I think we legally and contractually, we would be excused in, parts of the board discussion when it was, there was a conflict, and, really we would want to make sure that there was an official legally defined conflict. So hopefully the board members wouldn't just say, hey, Medtronic, could you leave? Hey, Medtronic, could you leave? Right, for every board meeting, because at that point, then it's not really worth the board seat itself. And of course, going in, we would try to clarify that with management and the CEO in particular, and potentially other investors or co-investors. But in areas where it was a conflict, we would of course step out. As far as our reasoning for being on the board, we did try to operate our ventures team very much like a financially driven organization, kind of a team, like a more typical independent VC. And from our perspective, there's a night and day difference between when you make an investment in a company and you're on a board versus when you're not on the board. Really understanding kind of what are the key things that management and the board are tackling, key strategic decisions. What's the cash position of the company? When are they going to be financing next? A lot of those things I think are pieces of information you could really only get if you're actually at the board meetings. Whether it's virtual, I guess, or in person, but and also building a relationship with management, I think was important for us too. While we were at Medtronic, we would not take strategic rights, or while I was at Medtronic, I should say, we would not take, hard strategic rights with our investments. Now, different strategics think about that differently, so I don't want to speak about other strategics necessarily, but at least the venture capital team at Medtronic, just felt that all of those rights were negotiated at the end of the day. And the best thing you could really do is build a strong relationship with management, because, if there was a strategic transaction or a big decision that was to happen, hopefully you've built a strong enough relationship that the CEO's first call to any corporates would be, your own corporate, right? So that they're not going to go and, survey all 5 different corporates to see who's going to raise their hand first. That hopefully you've built a strong relationship, and to be able to do that, I think being on the board was really important. So I think not only kind of the fiduciary kind of responsibilities of being on the board, but also the strategic benefit was, we are hopefully top of mind, but also could provide a lot of value and could benefit kind of on both fronts. But I'll turn it back to Cynthia to see if she has any kind of maybe outside thoughts on how she thought about corporates while she was kind of more of an institutional investor.
I will say my perspective on corporate strategics as part of your board or as part of your investor syndicate has evolved over the last decade. I think 10 plus years ago, when corporate venture groups were sort of not as active, not as sort of professional, and more I guess they're just more nascent. We tended to be hesitant to take strategic capital because we didn't want them to see the sausage being made. And I think that's still something you sort of have to be aware of. But as corporate groups have gotten more professionalized and have, a better understanding of early stage startup investing and see that as, part of their external R&D, I think they've come to add a lot of value. As Amrinder alluded to, they can tap into their BD groups and really give you sort of more direction on how you should be developing your company in a way that, would align with their vision for the future, so that you could be a potential M&A target for them. But I do think that you do have to sort of maintain appropriate boundaries so that you don't come too close to one strategic and kind of close off your other options. So that kind of gets into the sort of area of fiduciary duty where, especially if a corporate strategic is on your board, I think good practice is to always have a closed session where they step out of the room. And we did this oftentimes with other companies where if we had Covidien or Medtronic on the board, we'd ask them to step out and have a closed session, even if we didn't have anything to talk about, just because we wanted to make sure that, you know, we could either say we did, and sometimes we said, oh, you know, we're talking to a competitive. And sometimes we, just for good hygiene, had a closed session to see if there was anything that we could discuss. But I do think you need to know how to engage them, because I think they can be a strong resource for your company, but you should make sure that they don't have too much ownership or rights, because they can really then influence the direction of your company in a way that maybe paints you into a corner.
Great. Well,
Couple questions here, but
yeah.
I think we'll cover that later. One on how you remove a board member. I'd say that's really extreme, because usually if someone is a board director, it's usually stated in the vote in the bylaws, and that's a right that they have. And so if you were to remove a director, I think it would be either because they did something really wrong and maybe you'd have a vote, but you'd really have to have a discussion with that that director and understand why, you know, you'd want them off and who you would replace them with, and it would be sort of a board level discussion, but that's challenging.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's some general questions around kind of investment questions. Maybe we could save some of those for the end, just to cover some of these specific topics on the board. But happy to answer some of those questions at the end if we have time.
Sounds good.
So this slide, you know, and hopefully no one's offended by the last comment on this page, but we just kind of wanted to talk through what are the relevant skill sets and, you know, kind of the matrix of skills or experiences that one should consider when they're bringing on board members. You know, I think one of the key things to think about, so I won't go through all of these, but, you know, I think generally speaking, you want individuals that can help augment, you know, your skill sets if you're part of management. And also, hopefully, not everybody at the board looks the same, right? You don't want, and I don't mean this specifically from kind of a diversity point of view, whether it's gender, age, or ethnicity, but also, you know, individuals that add on to each other's, you know, skill sets. And so, you know, I think that should be the goal. I think as management is, you know, what is the best coalition that I could, you know, hopefully you could assemble so that you can, you know, have individuals that could really provide the most value that way, right? So, and I think one thing kind of nuanced here to think about, and I kind of touched on this earlier, is the different levels of maturity of a company matter here as well, right? So the experience or skill sets that are needed at the board should evolve as your company evolves. And I think everybody on the board, not just management, but hopefully everybody on the board should be very conscious of that and looking to fill kind of those new needs or new gaps at the board at the right time. You know, so I think it kind of goes to that question earlier around, you know, how long is the average board tenure or some of those kinds of things. If you want to quote unquote kick someone off the board, you know, hopefully the board and management are being thoughtful about this at all times. You could even theoretically, you know, have certain pre-agreed term limits to certain board members. You know, that could be something that could be considered. It starts getting a little bit more complicated if you do such things. But, you know, what's common is as a company, a venture-backed company, I'll speak to that because that's kind of more our swim lane. But as a company is venture-backed and raises additional rounds of capital, new investors will likely want to have representation on the board. And, you know, so part of their calculus is really thinking through what is the right board makeup, who should stay on the board, who should come off the board, who should replace whom. and what's the right kind of strategy and set of skills or experiences on the board go forward. So, I think some of that is determined during these kind of time periods, these venture financings. And I think those are good opportunities for everyone to kind of take a look at the board and see what are the different skill sets that we need to bring on moving forward. So,
no, I think those are all great comments. And that was actually a matrix that we used at another company I'm on the board of, just to decide sort of what are the characteristics we were looking for in an independent board member. And so these were, a couple of the considerations we thought about.
Yeah.
And I think this was sort of a key question of how do you really get the most value from your board? And I think for me, first and foremost, again, is ensuring you're aligned on your values and vision, because you really need to be working toward a common objective and goal. I think that alignment can sometimes, misalignment is often an issue when you have investors coming in different rounds of investment or at different valuations, or different stages. So maybe someone was a seed investor and they've been in the deal for 5 years, and another person just came in with new capital and have a longer term vision and don't mind investing in a large clinical study to drive greater value creation. But that early investor who may be out of capital or maybe really dilution sensitive, or at the end of their fund life cycle, might want to exit before that sort of next value inflection point. And so I think making sure everyone's aligned at the board level is really critical, so that you're working toward the same goal. Otherwise, a lot of your discussion at the board level is going to be sort of about resolving conflict versus toward working toward a common objective. And I'd say, sorry, go.
No, I was going to give an example actually on that specific point, but I could wait.
No, you can go for it.
Yeah. Just one example from kind of my past on that point, right? Thinking about alignment of incentives. One of the boards that I was on, this is a couple of years back, and the guilty shall remain nameless, I guess. But we had invested in this company. It was a pivotal stage company, so they were going to pursue their phase 3 kind of FDA approval study, US, Europe, etc. And when we came in, I think it was a Series D, I want to say. So as you can imagine, there had been investors in for a really long time, over 5 years, 7+ years in some cases. And those investors had very different, kind of incentives and thought processes and different timelines, than we did. They came in at a different price point than we did. They were, I think, were keen on exiting the business or company sooner necessarily than, we thought maybe made sense. They're also, I would say, in some cases they, and there's a few investors in that scenario where they were out of money too, right? They, whereas we thought maybe it makes sense to fund another round, especially, for example, when COVID hit and, a lot of companies needed some additional capital because of, halting clinical studies, and that they were still, losing cash or burning cash. We wanted to fund some additional capital into the company, but we wanted kind of everybody to hold hands and, across the investor groups to do the same. But as you can imagine, some of those earlier investors, didn't really allocate any additional funding at this point. They've been in some of these companies, in that company, for example, for 7+ years. And so I think all of those things are important to think about, whether you're an entrepreneur or a CEO or part of management, or you're on the board yourself. They make a pretty big difference as to how the different board members are thinking, and at the end of the day, everyone will tell you that they're kind of in it for the shareholders, and I think that is their fiduciary responsibility. But you have to understand that they have, potentially sometimes competing incentives as well. And even though they're going to try to do everything above board, they may have competing incentives. And so I think it's important to be thoughtful of those things, and hopefully get guidance from even outsiders sometimes to help kind of think through some of those factors.
Yeah, no, I think those are all really important points, and that's why I kind of reemphasize this on probably each slide. But I think, like you said, you've got to be able to trust each of your partners and your directors. And that's built through time, as well as frequent and transparent communication. I think a lot of times entrepreneurs are scared to report back whether or not there's a delay or a little setback. And I think that's a mistake, honestly. I'd rather hear news that's considered bad or, whatnot, rather than be surprised by it, 6 months down the line. Because I think not only one, you want to know what's going on with your company, but two, we could potentially help solve that problem. So I think, frequent communication with each director, both during and outside board meetings, is really important. So I'd say our best company CEOs were communicating, on a weekly or monthly basis in between board meetings. They're giving us updates monthly of, big events that has happened for them operationally, so that you're educating us in between the board meetings. And then during the board meetings, when you have your full group of directors, you're not spending time kind of updating them on sort of basics. You're really using them to that time to focus on key strategic decisions that you might be making. So that might be, if you're early stage, whether or not to come out of stealth. It could be whether or not, what your clinical study is going to look like, who your patient population you're going to study in. Like big sort of strategic questions, I think, is how you should be using your board during the meetings, rather than updating them on sort of the status of the business. That should be an important part of the board meeting, but should probably be like a third of the time. And the rest of the time should be really talking about strategic decisions that you have to make as a CEO. And I think lastly is, don't be afraid to put your board to work. We've got, a big network of people. And if it's not us personally, it could be our partners or people we might have worked with in the past. And so, it doesn't hurt to ask, do we know this person, or in this situation that we're seeing now in our company, where have you seen that and what have you done? What key regulatory consultants have you worked with that could be of use for us that have gone through this and seen this, the FDA? I think, asking for help makes a lot of sense.
Do you have an example? I know we've talked in the past about, one or two CEOs that you think really use the kind of the board meeting time really effectively. Do you have an example of one or two that you can kind of point to?
Yeah, right now, I had a board, for example, that they were enrolling their FIM, and the data was going to be available in 6 months. But they weren't sure, should we come out of stealth? When should we engage strategics and show them that data? Is it too early? And I think that was a key question, because you do want to educate sort of who your potential acquirers are, but you don't want to show them too much before it makes sense, because then there was, we thought we'd roll into a pivotal study, and then that would be really the point where you're creating meaningful value. And so there was a question of, do we come out of the gate now, or do we wait and delay? When do we come out? Do we wait for a major medical meeting, or do we kind of set the stage early? And a lot of time that, because of how we finance companies around milestones, a lot of that is usually kind of timed right around when you're running out of capital. And so there's always a question of, how much time do I want to have before I run out of capital, when I have that pivotal data in hand? So when is the right time to go out and talk to outside investors or strategics? Because that's kind of the next sort of divergence points in a company's development of, do I try to sell myself, or do I try to raise more capital off of this data? And timing is really critical.
Yeah.
So that was one of the questions that our board asked us during a meeting, and we kind of had an open discussion. It was very productive.
Yeah. And maybe one other example I could give, is even one of our portfolio companies, I think now at Vensana, they're a commercial stage company. But one of the key questions, so commercial stages, and they have a product and they're selling out into the marketplace. But I think one of the questions that the CEO and the rest of the management team kind of brought to the board is, does it make sense for us to run another clinical studies, right? Would that help kind of be a driver for sales down the road? Obviously, it would cost more money to do something like that. In this specific example, it would cost, tens of millions of dollars potentially to run this really large kind of definitive study in the space. But the upside could be massive, right, for the organization, for the company, for the shareholders, et cetera. And I think there's been 2 to 3 or more board meetings where that's been pretty much one of the key topics that this company has really kind of tackled. And I think that's where it really helps to have board members that have, experience kind of across the board, right? So we at Vensana spend a lot of time thinking about, not only customers, but also kind of the culture of customers and what are the triggers for them to adopt new medical technologies? And a lot of times those customers might be physicians, but it can also be, insurance companies, it could be hospital systems. In this case, it's actually a situation where you need physician champions, but you also need, hospital systems or providers broadly to kind of adopt this new type of technology. And then, you need payers to pay for it, right? So as I think a lot of these new types of technologies or technologies in general in the healthcare ecosystem, it's not a surprise to have so many different stakeholders. And, so I think we try to really be thoughtful about kind of the culture and what's going to make them tip. But then on the flip side, we spend so much of our time thinking about clinical studies and how to think about designing clinical studies and what are the right populations, how do you succeed, how do you win, how do you enroll, and will it matter, right, at the end of the day? And so hopefully, I think we've been helpful, but there's other board members that we have in that company that have very unique backgrounds as well that really bring a lot to the table as we kind of tackle that question for that company, for example. So anyway, hopefully that's helpful as you think about kind of bringing value and engagement. And maybe one other thing, since it's come up, I think there's a question from Helena about investors and strategics. When is the right time potentially to have them join, or how do you engage them? Just looking back to my time at Medtronic, I mean, I think once again, it really depends on kind of your intent. If you think that there's a lot of value to bringing a strategic or a corporate in early, I think in some cases or in many cases that can make a lot of sense. It provides validation to your company that, hey, this big strategic or small strategic, really believes in what we're doing. And I think investors do take note of that. On the flip side, there may be scenarios where you may want to hold off, right? I think Cynthia was talking about a company in stealth, where you want to get kind of all your eggs in a row, and when you're ready to have your big reveal, maybe that's when it makes more sense to start engaging corporates or strategics. And so I think it's a helpful way to think about it, is kind of what is the right timing, and hopefully your board and or your management team can kind of think through some of those things. Just reading these other questions. There's one question on compensation, and so we didn't go very deep into some of the mechanical aspects of the board, and we do have 1 or 2 more slides here. But as one thinks about compensation, and whether it's equity-based compensation, whether it's cash, whether it's a combination, should you be reimbursing board members for their role, their time, everything else? There is, I would say, what's standard practice is. It's not uncommon, I should say, to have some form of compensation. Now, if you have investors that are on your board, typically they're not being compensated. I'm going to speak in generalities now. Just keep in mind that this is sometimes case by case, but generally speaking, if you have like someone like a Vensana or a different investor that invests, they have equity in the company, they're taking a board seat, they may not be compensated from a cash perspective, but obviously there's an equity position that the investor will have, we may be, or the investor may be reimbursed for their travel and expenses when they're, during the board meetings themselves, for example. I think one area where it's, where you may want to consider this, and it's a little bit different, is when you bring on independents. In that scenario, you may actually compensate them in some form of mixture of equity and cash. And I'll put some very broad-based numbers around that, but generally speaking, you don't want to give away too much of your company, but to bring on that independent board member. But it could be as high, maybe Cynthia would have some guidance on this too, but I've seen as high as 2%, which in my opinion is a little bit high. But if you really do feel that independent board member is really bringing a lot to the table, then then maybe it makes sense. I think it's a case-by-case decision. As one thinks about the value that board member may bring. But I'll see if Cynthia has anything she'd like to add onto that question.
Yeah, I'd say in terms of independent director compensation, I've seen as low as a 1/4 point, but oftentimes it's 1/2 point, up to 1% plus. And I'd say maybe, that's with the expectation if they're starting off early, you might give them a little bit more equity. But then that would be diluted down over time to something that's a little bit more standard. So seeing above 1% is pretty rare, particularly in later stage companies. I think it's usually, about 1/2 point plus or minus, but seen anywhere in between, and granted anywhere in between, depending on this experience that board director independent sort of brings to bear. And I'd say, there's cash compensation, but that tends to be for public company directors. And it varies. So, Vensana does not take any compensation for being on boards, and most venture firms do not. Private equity is a different beast, and they often will ask for management fees as well as director fees. And even if you do pay that as a public director, you can ask for it to be sort of paid back, or we can give it back. But it's really sort of all up for discussion. There's no hard set rule on board compensation, but I do think that is an important way on sort of making sure your independent director is contributing. It's an important tool, just like you would for any team members.
So one of our last slides we wanted to cover was diversity in the boardroom. I think over the last few years, this has probably become more in prominence. With investors, with management teams, with board members, with employees in organizations as well. And I think rightfully so, right? I mean, I know sometimes there's some political anxiety around this, which, I think is a little bit nonsense, right? I do think that this is an important factor and element for board members to consider and management teams to consider. And I do think the first bullet point here is really expanding the view of diversity to a degree as well. That could obviously be gender, ethnicity, race, age, industry experience, backgrounds. And I guess when I say industry experience and backgrounds, hopefully those don't all mean the same thing, right? I mean, you can have somebody with similar industry experience, for example, but have very different backgrounds of how they grew up, where they grew up. Even if they're two individuals are from the U.S., obviously they may have very different kind of backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds or kind of life experiences, right? So, I do think this is an important kind of definition expansion, and one that I think individuals should really be conscious of when they're choosing board members. I think there's a lot of back and forth as to what value diversity brings to the board. And this is why there's been a lot of research on this, and some of it's, candidly, some of it's been very positive, and some of it has not shown maybe the returns that one would think. Now, I think the challenge with measuring this is it's hard, right? I mean, I imagine most people that are listening to this, have some sort of background in testing and measuring different things, whether you come from an engineering background or a science background or a finance background. I think one could all agree that it's hard to measure the impact of diversity. But I think what it should be obvious to most people is, it does help limit blind spots, having a very diverse board, and then also to understand kind of the evolving needs of your customer, right? What your customer needed, or a customer needed, I should say, 5 years ago versus last year versus going forward. I think really will continue to change, right? And I think having people who have various backgrounds and experiences, I think will only help strengthen kind of the assessment or understanding of what that evolution looks like. And increasingly, like kind of like the last point here, increasingly this is being more, required for public companies. I know the state of California and other states have kind of passed certain legislation to require one female board member at least. And that's for public companies, but I think even for private companies, you're seeing it more and more, and hopefully kind of moving in the right direction here as well. So I'll pause here, see if Cynthia has some additional commentary here as well, and would love to kind of get any questions on this point from those in the audience too.
No, I think you hit all the important points. I think it's something that's become increasingly top of mind, and it's probably 20 or 30 years too late, but I'm glad that we're having these conversations now. Some of it mandated by law, but however we get there, I'm glad that this is sort of now a top priority for a lot of our boards. I think the challenge though is, you're always trying to select who is best. And, we always talk about sort of the talent funnel of, who's available, because a lot of these, especially in the medical device field, a lot of it has been sort of white males and for decades. And so you go, well, who's available that has the right experience? And sometimes they may not be perfect, but I think they are going to provide a lot of valuable perspective that, maybe they don't have, multiple companies under their belt. But I do think that we should elevate other sort of experiences as well, because they do add a lot of value.
Yeah, maybe two things I'll add to this too, right, is I think one question that we tackle ourselves is, when is it too early to start thinking about diversity on the board? We obviously invest in companies at very early stages in many cases, and if you put kind of Vensana on the board and maybe the CEO on the board and maybe one or two other people, whether it's let's say a 5-person board, but very quickly you may realize that, especially for these early stages, is that, hey, we all think the same, we all kind of have similar backgrounds, and we all look the same in many cases too, right? So, I think being thoughtful about, how do we ensure that we're bringing people with differing backgrounds? And I think this is where maybe melding the second point that I want to make is, I think the independent board seat or seats is a very kind of valuable part of this discussion. For better or worse, if you think about the types of individuals who typically make up the board, let's say the CEO, a handful of investors, many times they tend to, kind of feel similar, right? They may look like the picture on the left, right? Whether it's CEOs or investors that are taking board seats. Whereas this is, I think, maybe it's a small way of trying to solve the problem, but it is a solution for the problem is, really being thoughtful about the independence that you bring on, whether it's one independent or multiple independents, and really trying to identify strong individuals with differing backgrounds, differing, gender, ethnicity, etc., experiences that could take those seats, and hopefully starting, as early as possible. I do think diversity in the boardroom and culture of the boardroom are very, very intertwined. Cynthia and I were talking about this actually, beforehand, where it's hard to know, kind of the chicken and the egg, which comes first. Do you have certain cultures that, prefer diversity in the boardroom, or do you have, diverse boardrooms that lead to really strong cultures in the boardroom? And, I don't know if we have an answer for that, but it isn't, a really important thing to think about, that if you're bringing these independents onto your board that can hopefully provide a unique lens, that'll only help, I think, the culture of the board moving forward. And I think having a strong culture is going to be really important as your partner to management. So maybe our last slide is just a handful of takeaways. Cynthia, do you want to cover some of these, or should we've kind of talked to them?
Yeah, I think we've spoken to them throughout, but I think that the key takeaway, and you'll always hear us say this, is just choose your partners wisely. They're going to be, with you along this journey. for an extended period of time. And, to the earlier question is, if you have to kick them off, it's really hard. So make sure you kind of get it right to begin with, because they'll shape your future and sometimes you can be stuck with them. I think, you've got to align incentives. Sometimes that's done through compensation. Sometimes that's done through financing structure, making sure all your investors are on the same page. Because if you have, earlier investors who came in at a different price than your later investors, whether it was at a lower price, and so, selling for them generates a decent return, but your later investors will have a lower multiple, they might not be as happy, or, vice versa. If, your earlier investors were recapped, that really creates a misalignment in incentives. And I think as the entrepreneur, then you're having to deal with that. And it's, not fun. And then just making sure that you are transparent and open with what's going on with the company. I think when you kind of have, if you're not aligned in what you want to do, I think just have open conversations and discussions until you get on the same page. And sometimes it's not always fun, but I think it's a necessary thing. And we always say, like, sometimes we have protective provisions and voting rights in our agreements when we're doing financing, but nothing should come down to a board vote. So I think if that's the case, there's something very dysfunctional. And again, investors might have voting rights and protections, but again, you should never have to use them. And I think lastly, just make sure your board is an opportunity and an asset, not an obligation. Yes, you have to have a board and there's certain roles and responsibilities and you're accountable to them for oversight, but just use them as a resource.
Well, that's great. It looks like you answered all the questions, and thank you so much for sharing your insight. And I always think that you can put all the right safeguard and everything, but at the end of the day, communication is always really important. And I always feel like everything looks great until it's not.
Yep.
And there will be times when things are difficult, and that's when you realize whether you choose the right partner or not. And sometimes hard to know. And hopefully you are old enough to see who you can work with better than others. And I think that comes with age, probably. Any other thought? Otherwise, then we should all let everybody go. And if not, well, thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Amrin. And thanks everybody for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Yep. Have a great Thursday, everybody.
Yay. Thanks.
Bye.